We lost in Austria, but we won in Italy. And Fillon is up and running for the generals in France. I think I'll make these practical politics videos a series in and of themselves, since I've noticed many of you really like them. So, without further ado, let's explore! Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, as you know, I'm in the middle of nowhere, so making videos is quite difficult until I get back to civilization, but that doesn't mean I'm disconnected from the news. So, since the last episode on practical politics, a few things have happened. Italy voted no in the referendum, Austria voted again for the Soviet citizen of the far left to be their president, and the French Republican Party nominated my favorite, François Fillon. So let's look into every piece of news, starting with Italy. Now, I haven't covered the Italian referendum on this channel at all because this referendum was not supposed to be internationally relevant. However, it did become internationally relevant because Matteo Renzi, Italy's former prime minister, decided to make it about him, announcing that he will resign if he loses. That is to say, if the no side wins in the referendum. And no did indeed win by a comfortable 60% majority, and Renzi resigned. And here's where things become rather interesting. Renzi was basically the Brussels puppet there, carefully executing every order passed down to him from the Politburo. Now, with his ousting, there are increasingly convincing calls for elections right now. Snap elections, basically. So who is calling for them? Well, it's first of all the far left and the far right. The far left through the openly populist Movimento 5 Stelle, a party which calls itself populist, and the far right, that will be Lega Nord. Now, there is a precedent on this. If you remember my video from back in April in which I compared Berlusconi with Donald Trump, I mentioned there that Berlusconi managed to trigger a snap election and take down the Romano Prodi cabinet. Silvio Berlusconi at that time was far less popular than the cause of smashing the establishment is right now. And he still managed to gather enough momentum to do it. So if the dissident parties unite for this purpose, they definitely can trigger snap elections, and if they do it, it is not beyond the realm of possibilities to get an openly Eurosceptic government. Remember, this is the country in which the state confiscates private properties from businesses and individuals in order to house diversity and cultural enrichment in them. And as you can imagine, your average Italian isn't particularly happy about this, to put it mildly. Now, the thing is that it's quite a long shot to get this done, but it was enough to get Brussels into trepidations because they're perfectly aware that almost every time anything EU-related is on the ballot, the voters will reject it. Which is why they constantly call for an end on referendums, just like the European Union's grandfather, the USSR. However, long shot as it may be, right-minded people in Italy watching this should consider shilling for the theme of snap elections. Not because those elections might deliver something good, since most Italian political parties are either insane or corrupt, but because there can never be too much disruption. The more disruption, the better. At the very least, using the local autonomy recently defended through this referendum and keeping up the disruption in the central authorities, you can successfully regroup to change things at the local level where it is far easier than on the national stage. The key here basically is to pace yourselves. There are many problems and one cannot tackle all of them at once, and at the moment the central government is standing in the way of solving almost any problem, which is why disruption is helpful and indeed needed. Now, if from the disruption arises a decent government, that's even better. But even if it doesn't, it's still worth the hassle of a snap election for its disruption effect only. Also, funny story, Italy also had its famous female promising blowjobs for those who vote her way, in this case the conservative way. And unlike the old leftist from the United States, she's actually keeping the promise, in addition to being less vomitive as a human being. It's almost like right-wing females are more reliable or something. Anyway, we'll come back to Italy when new developments shall occur. Now, on to France. As I'm sure you all know by now, François Fillon earned the Republican nomination, thus putting him on a remarkably straight path to presidency. As a short reminder for those who haven't seen the previous videos, it is very likely that the Republican nominee will be the next president, as the Socialist Party is in shambles and the general and generalized national consensus is to keep Marine Le Pen away from power. Now, speaking about the socialists, François Hollande, the incumbent, just announced that he will not run for re-election, becoming the first president in the Fifth Republic to make such a decision. Now, from a practical politics standpoint, his decision does make sense. His approval ratings are in single digits, and not even leftists want him anymore, let alone the general society. However, for the French political project, conservatives should aim to meddle in with the socialist primaries, which take place next month in January. The primary is set up to be very bitter, as the party is, as I was saying, fractured and in shambles. The worst result in the socialist primaries for non-leftists would be for Manuel Valls, the current prime minister, to win the nomination. Now, Valls has some decent ideas about the economy and is not afraid to publicly commit to ideas that piss off the socialist base of the party. However, that also makes him quite popular otherwise, which means he is dangerous for the final French political project for 2017, namely to get the Republicans both the presidency and a majority in the parliament. The best result for us would be Arnaud Montebourg, a hardline leftist who used to be the Minister of the Economy, who believes François Hollande is too right-wing. Basically, non-leftists in France should do to the Socialist Party what right-wingers in the United Kingdom did to the Labour Party when they pulled the lever for Jeremy Corbyn, thus making Labour unelectable for the foreseeable future. The same must be done in France as well. Get the socialists to nominate the most extreme left-wing bigot possible that also has a decent chance of clinching the nomination from Manuel Valls, who is right now the favorite for sure. Now, how do you do that? Well, via agitprop, of course. The key here is to choose right from the first attempt and then shill for that candidate in socialist circles ad nauseam. If you're hit by an argument such as, well, he doesn't stand a chance against Valls, remind them that this is a year of surprises. After all, François Fillon wasn't credited with much chances against Alain Juppé on the Republican side, yet he did pull it off. Inculcate them that this is a year for radical ideas, and thus the left, the home of radicalism, shouldn't pussyfoot around and nominate a moderate. Basically, what non-leftists in France should do is to pitch to the socialist base the message that Valls is too moderate. You don't have to lie to them. Valls is too moderate for the ideals of the Socialist Party, the French Socialist Party. So you're basically telling the truth as a leftist should see it. Sure, from a practical politics perspective, nominating Arnaud Montebourg would be a disaster, but the point is to create a disaster for the left after all. And the only honest way to do that is to convince them to be consistent with themselves, and thus they will fall on their own non-merits. Another pitch that you could try to the socialist base is to convince them to support Montebourg, is to tell them that if they don't, they will fall behind Jean-Luc Mélenchon, a former lifelong socialist who left the party because he thought the party had become too bourgeois and is now a member of the European Parliament from the far-left party that he founded. Such a message is bound to energize the socialist base to vote, well, for their own Corbyn. Just saying. Alright. That's enough with the French political project. Let's say a few things about Austria. Now, sadly, we did lose in Austria, with the Soviet citizen running for the far left, managing to beat the non-leftist candidate. Now, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if they rigged the election this time as well, just like they did back in May, just like they also postponed the rerun twice because Hoffer was doing too well in the polls, and also because Austria has a retarded voting law that allows 16-year-olds to vote in the elections. But anyway, there is no point in complaining right now. It's a miracle that the Constitutional Court was willing to acknowledge rigging and order a rerun once. It's highly unlikely that they would allow that again, even with compelling evidence. What needs to be done now is to, 1. Acknowledge that the country is a lot more cucked than previously thought, and I'm sorry if that's offending anyone, but it is true. Vienna and Vorarlberg, for instance, voted for the far left by 65 and 62% majority respectively. Now that's extreme cucking right there. And the second thing that needs to be done is for non-leftists to focus the most on highly populous areas in which Van der Bellen won by a sleep majority, namely Salzburg and Lower Austria, where the far-left candidate won by a 51.97% and a 50.66% majority. In both of these places, the difference was 13,000 votes. Now this means that those are the areas where non-leftists must pitch their case in the local culture the hardest so as to convince enough people to flip those results in the next legislative elections, which will take place in 2017, and this can be done. Convincing 30,000 people in two areas that the far left is not exactly what they had hoped for is not an impossible task by any means. Another thing that should also be done, and this is the hardest thing to do, but also the most necessary thing to do, is to convince Norbert Hoffer to stop kowtowing to the media. Basically, convince him to be more Trumpy and less like Romney. Well, that or find another charismatic leader to replace Norbert Hoffer. And I'm not joking. Hoffer was incredibly soft most of the time, almost begging the media not to call him a Nazi instead of telling them to go fuck themselves. And this is something all conservatives should take note. If someone calls you a Nazi, the most appropriate response is to double down on them. Brazilian-American philosopher Olavo de Carvalho teaches us that when someone calls you a fascist or a Nazi, the appropriate response is, no, your mother is a fascist. Here, watch this.
Se você não tem a capacidade de você fazer a crítica profunda dos próprios fundamentos do vocabulário, você vai ter que ceder ao vocabulário do seu inimigo. Então você tentará parecer que você não é reacionário,
că nu ești reacționar,
que você é até mais progressista do que o seu adversário. E isso, evidentemente,
și asta este evident,
desvia o foco da discussão. É uma estupidez imaginar que todas as questões referentes ao bem e ao mal podem ser equacionadas em termos de progresso e atraso, mesmo supondo-se que nós sabemos exatamente onde o progresso vai terminar.
Îmi presupune că noi știm cu exactitate unde o să termine progresul.
Então, essa rede de ilusões hipnóticas
Această rețea de iluzii hipnotice,
criada pelo vocabulário revolucionário,
creată de vocabularul revoluționar,
é a primeira coisa que nós temos que jogar no lixo.
e prima chestie pe care trebuie să o aruncăm la gunoi.
É inútil tentar concorrer politicamente com essa gente
Este inutil să încerci să concurezi politic cu acești oameni.
se você já é escravo dela do ponto de vista mental e intelectual.
Dacă ești deja sclav al acestei mentalități din punct de vedere mental și intelectual.
Então, longe de tentar escapar desse tipo de julgamento, nós devemos mostrar o nosso desprezo por ele. A maneira de fazer isso é a mais simples.
Felul de a face asta este cel mai simplu.
É simplesmente não aceitar a discussão nesses termos.
Pur și simplu este să nu acceptăm discuția în acești termeni.
Eu vou lhe dar um exemplo.
Să vă dau un exemplu.
Uma vez um indivíduo me chamou de fascista num debate. Eu respondi, fascista é sua mãe.
I-am răspuns, fascista e măta.
Ele então se fez de escandalizado
El s-a prefăcut scandalizat.
e disse, o senhor não está preparado para o debate democrático?
Nu sunteți pregătit pentru dezbaterea democratică.
E eu respondi, quem não está preparado para o debate democrático é sua mãe.
Și eu i-am răspuns, cine nu e pregătit pentru dezbaterea democratică e măta.
Ele ficou quieto, eu continuei com as minhas explicações. É exatamente assim que se deve tratar essas pessoas.
Now, I might end up subtitling the entirety of that video because it's such a good interview, but I'll have to get permission to do that from the copyright owners, which shouldn't be terribly difficult. But if you don't like Olavo de Carvalho, you can have Ben Shapiro, who also says that when someone calls you a racist or a fascist, the worst possible thing to do is to sit down with that person and try to explain why you're not a racist or a fascist. That tells the left and to the neutral audience that the critique is reasonable and that there is a legitimate and reasonable case for which one might think you're a racist or a Nazi. Instead, the response should be, no, you're being hysterical and unreasonable, which means you're not worthy of my time, get the fuck out of my face. This is what Hoffer should do a lot more often. And this is what any non-leftist, conservative or not, should do in the face of slander. You can say many things about Hoffer and his party, but calling him or his party Nazi is unreasonable and slanderous. There is no reasonable case to believe that, and such slander should be responded to in kind. Basically, the non-leftists should take away the leftists' monopoly on insults, and this is what Hoffer did not. Instead, he begged the media not to call him a Nazi and acted weak. The idea that it is better to act moderate should also be indeed quashed. Moderation is not inherently good, especially in the face of evil. And more to the point, Hoffer's policies are anyway very moderate to begin with. Compare this, we're gonna build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, or a moratorium on Muslim immigration is definitely in order until we figure this out, and compare these two with the soft-spoken policies of Hoffer of, well, maybe we should reform our welfare a little bit so non-citizens won't abuse it anymore. Please don't call me a Nazi for saying that. In politics, it is often better to start with something a lot more radical than you actually want, so you can have room for compromise. The left did understand this game decades ago, but we're still refusing to play it. It's almost like we're afraid of winning or something. That's what Trump did. He started with the most extreme version of his ideas and then slowly paced the public to where he wanted it in the first place. That's how you do it. And that's what non-leftists in Austria should strive to do. François Fillon in France seems to know this already, becoming popular with the Thatcherite economic program, something which was thought to be impossible in France. And again, Trump became president even though before he announced his candidacy, the whole political establishment was competing on who can silence discourse about illegal immigration the harshest. And he won on an anti-illegal immigration platform and with crowds chanting, "Build the wall." The important lesson to draw from these two examples is that one has to genuinely believe in what he preaches and to say what he means and mean what he says. Sure, this tends to make you unpopular with the left, but as the Hoffer example shows, or the Mitt Romney example for that matter, you will be unpopular with the left no matter what you do. They'll call you names and slander you and play unfair and rig elections anyway, so why bother trying to appease them? Anyway, that's it for now. I'll try my best to make these kinds of videos, well, semi-regular, focused entirely on practical politics in Europe, and since 2017 has quite a lot of interesting event schedules, we will have a lot to talk about in the next current year. And with that being said, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.